Today I'm going to be talking about a A/B testing tactic that can have a massive impact on your conversion rates and your A/B testing strategies, and that's running radical redesign tests. Now, as soon as I say radical redesign tests, I know some of you are going to be squirming in your seats and feeling kind of like this, right? Radical redesigns are scary. They can be scary. They can feel scary because a new design on a page of your site can sometimes be just as likely to drop conversion rates as it can be to lift conversion rates. And I think we've all seen examples of failed design tests. But what I'm going to talk about today are some ways that you can run effective radical redesign tests on your site. I'm even going to suggest that if you're not radically redesigning key conversion pages of your site periodically throughout the year, you may be missing out on huge opportunities with your audience. So I'm going to compare your website for a minute to a chainsaw. Okay? So you've got your chainsaw, you've got your landing page, your conversion page, and you're out there, you're cutting down trees, right? You're converting visitors, generating phone calls, selling product, whatever the purpose of your page is. Over time, that chain on your chainsaw is going to start to dull. So what do? You go and you start running tests on your page. So you test in new headlines, and you test your images, you test your buttons, right? And that's like kind of like going around your chainsaw and sharpening one individual blade at a time. It's something you need to do in order to keep that blade, that chain, sharp. But what you'll find is that eventually you'll get to a point where that chainsaw is about as sharp as you can get it. And so the only way to make rapid improvement is to take the whole chain off and put on a better one. And that's kind of what running a radical redesign test does. So let me show you an example when I say radical redesign testing of what I'm talking about. So this is obviously an old chainsaw, right? This design hadn't been touched in years. They actually had run some headline testing, and their headline testing generated about a 3% lift in conversion rate. So very small. We came in and we tested 3 radically different designs for this particular landing page. Our winner generated a 64% lift in conversion rate, and which, that's months, if not years, of testing on the old design. But not only that, the interesting thing was after we ran this radical redesign and pushed the winner, we ran a round of headline testing and saw a 20% lift in conversion rate compared to a 3% lift before. So one interesting thing happens when you test in a radical redesign. You effectively reset the tables on your A/B testing efforts, and you give yourself room to continue to grow with your audience. So the question comes up, when should I run radical redesign tests? First is if you're going to redesign anyways, right? If you're redesigning your product. Second, if conversion rates are stagnant. So if you're running A/B tests and you're no longer finding lift in conversion rate. And finally, at the start of a new test cycle, and this is where I want to talk about for a minute. So let me show you an example of what a test cycle can look like. So you start out, you do your research. You're going to dive into your analytics, see if you can figure out what challenges your users are having with your current page or what opportunities you may have in front of you. You put together a strategy, and you launch immediately into the radical redesign. Now, you might have to do a couple of rounds of redesign testing. Maybe you don't find a winner immediately. But once you've found a winner in that radical redesign test phase, you analyze, and you move on into the iterative testing phase. Now, this is where you're going to go and you're going to test everything on that new design. So you're going to test your headlines, content, images, colors, buttons, everything on the page, right? And when you've gotten through your iterative testing phase, then you're going to start the cycle over again. Now, this whole process should take no more than 6 months. And that's not an arbitrary number. What we found is that about every 6 months, user behavior on the web radically changes. And the reason for that is that about every 6 months, there's new best practices. There's new design best practices, there's new trends. And And your CEO is going to keep you well aware of this, right? Your CEO is going to be running into your office going, look at what Apple's doing on their website. We've got to copy them, right? Or here's what our biggest competitor's doing. We got to do something like them. But the problem with that line of thinking is that once something has become a design best practice, it stops being a best practice. Let me say that again. Once something becomes a design best practice, it stops being a best practice. That's because once your users start to see things everywhere on the web, they start to ignore them. And this happens all the time. It happens with advertisements. It happens with parallax websites, right? The first time you go there, they're really cool and awesome. And then you start to see them everywhere, and you start to numb that particular thing out. And so if you're not doing a radical redesign test on your key pages of your site every 6 months, you may be operating under assumptions that are no longer valid for your audience. So I'm going to suggest 4 radical rules for creating an effective redesign test. Radical rule number 1, test multiple hypotheses. Now, we heard about this on Monday, about testing hypotheses. And it's something that's considered a best practice when you're running A/B tests, but for some reason, when companies start to test design, the idea of hypotheses goes out the window, and it's all creative, right? Maybe it's just because design is in our right brain, and maybe testing's over here in our left brain. Whatever it is, companies just don't do it when they think about design. So let me show an example of testing multiple hypotheses and what that can lead to. So this particular page, this was a best practice landing page for PPC. They had done lots of A/B testing on this page, and it was working great for their campaigns. We approached a radical redesign, and we tested in 4 hypotheses. And obviously, you'll notice that we changed a lot of things on this page, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But our first hypothesis was if we can create a variation that speaks more to the user. So these are small business owners looking for loans. So if we can create an image that looks a little bit more like a small business owner, resonates more with the audience, we'll find higher conversion rates. Our second hypothesis, we took that a little bit farther, and we said, well, maybe we can, if we test multiple different types of business owners, it'll be more likely to resonate with the audience. Our third hypothesis was by removing the image and giving content, the users would have a better reason to fill out the form, right, to convert. Our final hypothesis was the users would prefer a quick, clear path to conversion, so a call to action and a form. So I'll let you guys guess real quick which one you thought won. And our winner was the one that removed the images and focused on content. Now, that may seem like common sense to you, or maybe not. But the interesting thing here, and the reason I wanted to bring it up is, if we hadn't tested multiple hypotheses, we would not have found this extreme lift in conversion. Because what the client wanted to do was, let's just redesign the existing page and let's get a better image, and that will be the best approach. So you've got to be willing to think outside the box and test multiple hypotheses. Radical rule number 2, separate desktop and mobile. Now, we heard about this a lot yesterday, about the difference between desktop and mobile. But again, when it comes to design testing, for some reason, companies are saying, whatever works for my desktop users, we're going to take that and shrink it down for mobile. That may work for some users, but for a lot of users, that doesn't work. And that's because the use case for a mobile device is totally different. So I'll show an example. And sometimes you have clients that let you use their images. Sometimes you just have to use pictures of cats instead. So I apologize for that. But for this particular page, this was the mobile responsive version of the desktop site. So for the desktop site, 4 images, 4 product shots with value points. That worked very well on desktop. Shrunk it down for mobile. Mobile conversion rates were actually somewhat decent. This was working okay. There was a call button that was down below what I was able to show on the design here. But we said, well, maybe the mobile user is going to want a more customized approach. So we tested in 3 alternative ways of presenting this page. We said, well, maybe the users will want to call in. And so let's test different ways that we can feature a click-to-call. Maybe the users won't want as many images or will want the information presented differently. So let's test different ways of showing the content. The winner, we ended up having the click-to-call button featured very prominently at the top. We removed most of the images. The form was lower on the page. So what we thought would happen was, well, call volume is going to go up and form completions are probably going to go down. What happened was we saw a lift to both. So form completions and call volume increased. And that, again, reinforced the idea to us that our mobile users are engaging with our page completely differently than our desktop users. And so if you don't separate the two, you're likely going to miss out on major opportunities. Radical rule number 3, use your tools, break the rules. Let me explain to you what I mean when I say that. So when I say break your rules, I'm talking about the rules that almost every company has for their users. Their assumptions, best practices, they may even be things that you've tested in the past and found to be true. They sound like this. We don't believe in above and below the fold, right? Our users scroll and read. Or we only design above the fold. Or less content is more. Or more content is better. Or our users love image-heavy pages. Or our users hate images, right? These types of assumptions that you have about your users. But because user behavior is changing so rapidly on the web, if you don't challenge your assumptions, then again, you're operating on assumptions which may not be true. So let me show you an example. So a client in the medical space had run some tests a couple of years ago and found that their users were scrolling, they were engaging with a lot of content on the page. So they had designed all of their pages on their site to be super long scroll, lots of information, multiple calls to action down below the fold. Well, we installed heat mapping, so this is a crazy egg scroll map. We found that that was no longer true. So the users weren't scrolling on most of these pages. So the first thing, of course, that the client says is, well, we've got to figure out a way to get them to scroll down because all that information is really important. So let's test some visual cues to tell them that there's information down below the fold, right? Let's try and show them a way to scroll down. But again, that's sort of like forcing your audience to do what you want them to do, right? So we tested one variation where we just removed all of that content below the fold and ended up seeing a 63% lift in form completions, and we had another side bonus of 530% lift in email subscriptions, right? So we found another thing that was way at the bottom of the page that we didn't think was very important, but apparently that was something that was important to the users. But you've got to be willing to challenge your current assumptions and test breaking the rules and see what happens and see what your audience is doing now. Radical rule number 4, you need to run radical redesign tests for at least 2 weeks. Now, it's best practice in the A/B testing space to run a test until you get at least a 95% statistical significance. But let's be honest, a lot of us can get a 95% statistical significance in a day, right? Maybe even an hour. A 95% statistical significance by itself is meaningless. So a lot of companies will give themselves another minimum standard to meet of, okay, well, let's run a test for at least a week. We'll get one day of the week in there, right? But radical redesigns, even more than any other type of tests, are going to have erratic conversion rates. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So here's a radical redesign test we ran. The green line on the bottom is our control design. The blue and pink lines above that are variants that we tested. You can see at the end of the first week, our 2 variants were tied. So what would most companies do at this point? Most companies would say, well, let's keep it going for a couple more days. We had a 95% statistical significance at this point, so let's give it a couple more days and see if one pulls ahead. And sure enough, all throughout the next week, variant B pulled ahead. But if we had called the test at this point, we would have called the wrong winner. Because into the 3rd week, experience C, the true winner, pulled ahead. And then once the data leveled off and normalized, we found that experience C was by far the winner. But you need to give your test long enough for that erratic behavior to end and let your test normalize. And usually at least 2 weeks is required for that. So the last thing that I want to just touch on is after you run a radical redesign test, it is so important to follow up with rigorous iterative testing and test everything on that new design. Every test can't be a radical redesign. So you've got to go around and sharpen every blade on that chainsaw, right? Test your headlines, test your call to action, your content. This is where you're really going to drive specific learnings about your audience. And then follow up and radical redesign test again. Every 6 months, radical redesign test, and you guys will see how your audience behavior is changing, and you'll create better experiences for your audience. Thank you.
Ooh, thank you. We have lots of questions coming in. And the one question that is coming up over and over is everyone wants to know about the tools.
Yes.
Let's specifically go first to like small businesses. What's the best tool or your favorite tools specifically to use in testing for someone who doesn't necessarily have a huge budget?
Yeah, testing on a budget, I would absolutely say to use either Optimizely or Visual Website Optimizer. I personally like Optimizely the best. They actually have a free account up to about 10,000 visitors. But they have a very good platform. When you get into more enterprise level testing, there's really no substitute for Adobe's Target product, but it is very cost prohibitive. So yeah, I'd recommend starting with Optimizely.
All right, so there you go, everyone. The other thing that we have is some of the, a number of questions. People keep coming back to the mobile versus desktop. And they want to know, will it radically hurt you if on mobile you have a lot less content or you have something different? I think the worry is that making those two different can cause other types of issues. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah, and specifically with performance, again, my mantra is that you just have to test because you never know what the difference is going to be with your mobile audience. So, the example that I showed one particular type of behavior, but every audience is going to perform differently on mobile. Some like more content, some like less content, some like to have everything right in that initial screen, right? But if you don't test on your mobile audience, you'll never know. You'll never know how radically different your conversion rates could be. And that's really the challenge that I think that most companies face is once they've got that responsive design, once they have a mobile experience, they call it good. And that's not good enough, especially with how much we see mobile continuing to grow.
Yeah, it's very much like what Mig was saying. It's like, oh, you got it responsive, your site's done, it's mobile, yay, right?
Yep.
But without looking and digging into it a bit deeper, you might not actually know for sure.
Exactly.
So another question is, everyone wants to know about like how it's going to mess up your SEO, doing this testing. And I know this is a question that has, comes around every year, I feel like. But do you have any tips or any don't worry about it, any good advice on making sure you don't kill your SEO by running some of these tests?
So the actual testing process won't affect your SEO at all. So the way that most of these testing tools work is it's just a line of JavaScript, and so it's going to serve up these different experiences via JavaScript. So it won't affect your SEO during the process. Now obviously once you call a winner, if it is dramatically different than your old page, you'll just have to monitor that and see if you've removed a bunch of content, did that affect your rankings, right? But the actual testing process itself does not affect your SEO.
All right, and Dave Minkala wants to make sure that we ask this question. He's posted it to several hashtags. Why do you think that the erratic performance trend between the variants exists that first week or so? Whereas, that picture you're showing that's like, you think it's one thing, and then after it levels off, you see it's something totally different.
Yeah, so there's a lot of reasons for that. So if you have return visitors to your site, right, you're going to have people that are coming and going, ooh, a new design, let's check this out, right? So that's part of it, is that initially people are going to be checking these new experiences out, seeing what's going on. There's also just erratic behavior in general when you're running A/B tests. So when you run any type of A/B test, the initial test data, because you have such limited data, every additional conversion or every additional 10 conversions is going to affect those conversion rates so much. And so it's super important to wait until those erratic conversion rates normalize. And a lot of companies will put a test up. The first day, they'll see like 150% lift and go, we got to call it, right? You got to push that winner now or else I'm missing out on a ton of revenue. But I have seen, and there's lots of great blog posts out there about false positives, right? Or false winners. And this happens all the time. You'll have a variation that wins for a couple of days and then it turns out over the long run loses. So it's super important to give the test long enough where you see those conversion rates normalize, you see the data kind of level off before you call any conclusions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have learned a ton, and I'm sure you're going to get bombarded with even more questions after. I'm assuming you'll be around to take some questions. So everyone, let's give a big round of applause and a thank you to Chris.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot.